Dear guests, welcome to our next panel today, which I have already heard has a potential to rescue the gender dimension of our discussions today. So welcome once again, dear guests in this room, also dear guests that follow us online. Just a couple of technical issues for those who are not with us today physically in Berlin. You can follow us online via the YouTube channel of the German Belarusian Society. The streaming will be in English there. You can also follow us via the account of the German Belarusian Society in Facebook. The streaming will be there in English as well. And if you wish to see the streaming in English, in Russian, you can use the YouTube channel of Еврорадио. Я повторю это по-русски для тех гостей, которые следят, слушают, может быть, тоже, но для тех гостей, которые слушают нас онлайн.
And I repeat this information in Russian.
Языке через YouTube-канал Еврорадио. So our discussion will be in two languages today with a simultaneous translation, Russian or English. Our guests are free to choose which language you would like to use. And please make sure you speak not too fast so that our translators today can do their job well. So, dear guests, there is something I have in my hands today, and hopefully you as well. This is the policy paper that we would like to present today. It has a nice orange color, and it is named "4 Scenarios for Belarus by the End of 2022. You can still find some copies of it outside of this room, and for those who follow us online, it will be available today by the end of the day also as a web version so that you can spread it in your circles. So please do it. And this is actually something quite proud of, and I'm really thankful to our experts, to those who are here today, and also to those who joined us online. This is a result of outstanding brainstorming and intellectual effort of our experts who come from 3 countries, from Germany, Poland, and Belarus, and who have been working together offline and online for about 1.5 months. So from the end of September till the middle of November. And this is the result that we have here today and would like to present. So, dear guests, I think we all agree on the fact that Belarus is experiencing today one of the gravest political crises in its history. And we already see that it has both threats to its local population, to Belarusians within the country, but also to the European security. And the current migration crisis on the Belarusian borders is just one of the examples of that. And even though we do understand that many or most of the internal processes within the Belarusian political system are quite non-transparent, and that the situation is changing very fast, literally every day or even every hour, we still have this need for politicians, for the civil society, but also for the business structures to have a more or less an understanding or a minimal vision of what is actually possible in Belarus in the short term. So that's why we decided to take this scenario method and to limit it up to the end of next year, because for us it didn't make a lot of sense to think further, like 5 or 10 years, because the situation in Belarus is just changing too fast, and there are quite a lot of the so-called black swans. That means that not expected factors that come too often in the last year. So just to give you a short description of what it actually means, I hope we made it understandable for the public, but once again, I just want to make sure that it's understandable. So we have 2 drivers. The experts decided to take 2 drivers, which actually were important for the developments of political system in Belarus by the end of next year. And the experts also decided that those 2 drivers, both of them, you can see them here, like two arrows. One of them is democratic transition, the other is social mobilization, the horizontal one. Experts decided that those drivers should be internal drivers. There was a huge discussion, I remember, during our brainstorming whether we should take EU as an actor, as a driver, or Russia. But experts decided then that it is important to take internal drivers so that we see that Belarus is not perceived as a kind of an object of Russia-EU relations, so that we see that actually the developments within the Belarusian society and within the Belarusian political regime are decisive for the whole future of Belarus. But at the same time, we have like the reaction of Russia or the reaction of the European Union as areas of application. So in each scenario, you can see what happens with the relations between Belarus, EU, and Russia, and also some other areas of application, depending on what scenario you have. So you have here plus and minus, two pluses and two minuses, which means that the most possible democratic transformation or transition by the end of the next year, and the most possible social mobilization also by the end of next year. I'm not going to tell anything about the names of scenarios. We'll start shortly with a presentation, short presentation of each of them. It's also important to say that there are we have a black swan factor. So black swan is something which is really not expected. Something like, for example, Ryanair story with Protasevich, or something like the current migration crisis, which no expert could have predicted. So these black swans you will also find in our scenarios, because we needed them in order to come to a plus or a minus correspondingly on the drivers by the end of the next year. And the last, before we start the discussion, it is also important to understand, I mean, those scenarios, of course, we do not expect that this will be the reality by the end of next year, but these scenarios was an intellectual effort to see what is actually possible, and at the same time, it is important to see what comes out of these scenarios, which means what insights do we have, what chances and risks we have for the development, for the political development of Belarus, because these insights, chances and risks, they will remain independently of the fact whether our scenarios will become a reality or not. And at the very end, of course, we have also policy recommendations to various decision makers, but we'll come to that at the end. So my last point before we start the discussion, this project or this policy paper was produced within the project which is called Network for Belarus. It is an international project that is financed by the Foreign Minister of Germany and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you so much for making it happen. And it has partners, 7 partners in Poland, Germany, and Belarus. I'm also part of this project and part of this network of Belarus, or the Arbeitskreis Belarus, which is in English is a working group in Belarus and Germany. My name is Olga Dryndova, and I will be moderating the discussion today. So let's start. I will start with the short presentation. Well, not I, but our experts will start with a short presentation of scenarios. I think you're quite curious about what experts came to by the end of the next year in Belarus. So the first scenario is called Stable Swamp. I would ask Kaciaryna Shmacina, who is a research fellow at the Belarusian Institute of Strategic Studies and a Belarus-born expert in Belarus. I would like to start with you. What is a stable swamp, Katya? We see that in your scenario, you have 2 minuses. So the social mobilization is low, and the democratic transition is also low. We could imagine it could be quite a depressive scenario. You also didn't need any black swans to come to this scenario. So how does it look like? What events did you need to come to these 2 minuses at the end, and what happens within Belarus?
Greetings. Happy to be here and talk about or start talking about the most gloomy scenario, which is called the stable swamp, stabilное болото. This scenario actually envisions that both factors would be hitting it slow, both the democratic transition and social mobilization, by the end of 2020 or over the course of the next year. And essentially it means, say, like from my perspective, from the perception of Belarusians, that would envision the scenario where the social mobilization decreases and people sort of resort back to this political apathy that we observed in the previous years of like 20-something years of Lukashenko rule, where people literally consider this enormous democratic uprising and mobilization of forces as yet another failed attempt to get rid of the authoritarian rule. The repressions continue as they continue today, as we observe them. And they lead to the point where, again, there is no, people just tend to dissolve those grassroots initiatives, those solidarity networks that were created during past year and a half. And literally people would just get back to their dachas and kitchen talks with the understanding that, okay, we failed yet again. And then when it comes to the elites, then they tend to consolidate their positions, and most particularly the Lukashenko regime. So he would manage to stabilize the situation, also, of course, relying on repressions, but also sort of tending to preserve the status quo, to reassure the interests of the elites so that they won't be sort of tempted to look about some democratic, to think about some democratic concessions. For us, for the Belarusians, or at least like from my perspective, this is the most disappointing and the horrible scenario, in the sense that this would just cross out all the aspirations and all the everything that was actually achieved by Belarusian pro-democratic protest in the past years. This would also envision that the EU and the West and the rest of the world would just naturally shift its attention elsewhere, and then the support for the Belarusian democratic forces, those who still operate inside the country, and those who operate from exile, they would just lose their relevance and their sort of appeal. And then again, like the West and those liberal democracies that tended to support Belarusian protests, they would just shift their attention elsewhere. And then we will find ourselves in the swamp, where there is like no future, developments to expect. And we also thought about this like constitutional referendum, which Lukashenko was talking on and off for past years. Here I would also maybe point out that before the 2020 crisis, he was talking about the constitutional referendum as the way for sort of to ensure his smooth transition from exiting from the political stage. But then when the crisis unraveled, he changed his rhetoric, trying to sell this reform as a way out of the current political crisis. So in this scenario, we just sort of assume that there would be this inertia where the constitutional referendum would be just a cosmetic reform and possibly even consolidate even more powers within the power vertical. There won't be any redistribution of powers as it was sort of previously promised one way or another. Let's say like there were some aspirations that maybe the presidential role would decrease, and then let's say like parliament would become more viable force. So no such thing is happening because the elites see that there is no challenge to the status quo, and essentially there is no need to make any democratic concessions. And I would also point out here that there are no like black swans in our scenario, because we think that, well, if there is some unexpected factor jumping in, this would sort of change the dynamics, and then this would maybe open the window of opportunities again for the democratic actors or for some sort of, again, like social mobilization. But here we just assume that like if there is the natural course of events, then we would just find ourselves in this like stability we've observed in the previous years.
Thank you so much, Kaciaryna. So, absence of black swans is also a kind of observation. So that means that any black swan that is coming, even if it looks like a migration crisis, could still, according to your scenario, potentially open the windows or opportunities not to come to this stable swan scenario by the end of next year. Thank you so much. Our next scenario is called bitter entrenchment. It has a low level of democratic transition. Maybe just a small comment, democratic transition doesn't necessarily mean in our work that regime change with democracy at the end happens in Belarus. Democratic transition is actually every steps, all kinds of possible steps towards a bit more democracy in Belarus that we have nowadays. It's important to understand. So in this scenario, we have a low level of transition, democratic transition, but at the same time, a high level of social mobilization. Dear Maryna, Maryna Rakhlei, I'd like to introduce our next expert. Maryna is policy officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and an acknowledged expert in Belarus in Germany. Welcome you here. So Maryna, how does it come together? There is nothing happening in direction the democratic transition, but people in Belarus under oppression still remain highly mobilized. Please give us a sign how it's possible, and maybe also for you personally, what was most challenging for you while working in a scenario group with this plus and this minus?
Thank you, Olga, and especially for this very warm introduction, very friendly introduction. Works? It's okay, good. So that was exactly the challenge. How do you ensure that in spite of the fact that the repressions continue, there's nothing going on politically in Belarus, there are no changes for the better, so to speak, that social mobilization is still high and that it can remain high. It was interesting for the team that worked on this scenario that we thought that this was the scenario that naturally originates in the current situation that we have. It was interesting to see that there were other teams saying no, that their scenario is also a continuation of the status quo we have now. Because I would say that what we observe nowadays in Belarus, that's basically the same thing, that social mobilization probably is not that visible as it was a year ago, but it is still there, despite the fact that the level of repressions is very high. To ensure that in our scenario, in this fantasy within the framework that we have, we had to resort to the black swan, it was because of the COVID continues and Sputnik and the Chinese vaccine do not work. We thought that something that is probable is that one of the high-profile incarcerated leaders will contract COVID and die. Also due to negligence of prison authorities and Belarusian authorities, and if it's somebody of the level of Viktor Babarika, who I hope will survive any pandemic situations and will be soon free, that it will resonate not only in the Belarusian society but also in the West, because it would be very clear who is to blame for this loss. For the constitutional reform, we thought that because again the framework was that politically nothing is changing, that Lukashenko will not be brave enough to see what referendum what can happen in the country if a referendum takes place. If in the current situation, that was even before the death of this opposition leader, if social mobilization will pick up and grow, and also a very important factor. If he's the vertical, the loyal people who has always helped falsify or ensure the right outcomes of the elections, if they're still loyal, as soon as you cannot be sure that the protest will be too big again, and that your people will not be on your side, the referendum is not possible. So in our scenario, Lukashenko thinks of a loophole saying that you need a referendum in Belarus only if you introduce changes into the current constitution. If you change constitution to the extent that it's a new one, then you only take it through parliament. So it's the whatever plan the authorities have, it's not published. They take it through the parliament unanimously, of course, and I think by September then it comes into force. What we know from this, from the reforms, that the new age of a presidential candidate is 25, which is clearly a hint that Lukashenko will stay until 2029 and then transit to different political institutions overseeing a Belarusian political system, and that his son can assume the office of the president, because by that time he is going to be 25. Again, this is not that we think that is very plausible or is possible. Probably yes, but this is what I mean in the realm of the
how
legal
you came
framework.
to plus and to minus.
One word to Russia. Because the EU, of course, reacts with more sanctions and increased support to the democratic groups, also due to the reason because they stay mobilized and they need support. And Russia, interestingly enough, what we see also in the recent weeks, quite frustrated with Lukashenko, but not really ready to act and to put pressure on him to change anything. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Maria. Just a short question, because it was really, I think, the most often question that you got from also from your colleagues. You were talking about high level of mobilization in your scenario, right? And because we already heard it today from the other discussion panel, somebody said, okay, we don't see any protests on the streets in Belarus, right? So how do you, but somehow you found another form of this social mobilization to be high in your scenario. If you could just in 30 seconds give us this understanding how high mobilization is possible without street protests.
It's in the regions, it's online. These are occasional outbreaks of protests on different enterprises across the country demanding new wage and better conditions, so that it remains visible that the a serious portion of Belarusian society is still very actively demanding change and rule of law.
Thank you. So it's rather on a low scale, but it's still the high level of mobilization that we have in your scenario. Thank you. As a next guest or expert, I would like to introduce, Agata Wierzbowska-Miazga. No, I'll do it myself. Agata Wierzbowska-Miazga, who is kind of Polish side of the expertise in our project, and Agata also used to work for the Polish institution OSW, the Institute for Research of Eastern Europe. So we're happy to have you here, Agata. Thank you that you came from Poland and are with us today. Your scenario is named Belarusian. I mean, we could have an idea of what it could mean. It's a kind of some kind of combination of Belarus and Kazakhstan, but what exactly is combined here, and what happened to make this scenario reality? To give our guests the understanding of what happens there, you have a high level of democratic transition, but social mobilization still remains low. Why? How?
Well, to begin with, I want to say that we speak so much of democratization, so I'll use my democratic right to choose my language. So why? It's a good question, and how is this possible? We as experts also posed this question to us, and this question arose naturally. So we were divided into such groups. So we found ourselves in this group. It was a very interesting experience, and within this scenario, we found one plus. Some minor democratic change. So this is the most optimistic variant of those changes that we could imagine is changes like those that took place in Kazakhstan. That's why we chose this name for our scenario. We thought that the maximum that could occur is a constitutional referendum in which would produce a People's Assembly to be headed by Lukashenko. And of course, he will remain the most important, the key political actor. But now, his position will depend upon him personally, upon his personal actions. It will not be enshrined in law, in legislation. And this leaves hope that after Lukashenko is not around, there will be a slight chance for change, because the system will already be prepared, kind of prepared for that. Also possible within our scenario are elections, not honest and free elections, but elections, so-called elections, quote, elections unquote, in which only representatives of the powers that be would be able to run and be nominated. Their names already figured in the first panel today, so it will be elections without choice. But despite the fact that such elections will not be free and honest, the people will not be too unhappy, because they will have still some election. Okay, we have a question. It's quite clear. People's Assembly, not liked by everyone, but theoretically it could provide some dynamics. What about social mobilization? Why is it low? It took you a whole of 2 swans, and it's very interesting because given today's situation on the border, you already have one crisis situation. Yes, one swan we do have now. We thought initially that Poland would be the country who will start talking to Lukashenko. And Poland is directly involved in today's crisis, and we feel the results of this crisis. This issue with migration also aroused a lot of internal strife and tension. And our thinking was that there could be that a gesture in this context would be taken as treason in the democratic society. Okay, this is what Mr. Latunska told us today, talking about this scenario.
Last one is for me the most interesting, but at the same time the most fantastic one. It's named Transition by Mistake, and this is the scenario where you have both high social mobilization and high democratic transition. And guess what? Our experts didn't find any other solution as to remove Lukashenko from power, because with Lukashenko, this seemed to experts not to be possible. So, dear Fabian Burkhardt is our expert also from the German side. Nice to have you here. Fabian is a researcher at the Leibniz Institute for East European Studies in Regensburg. Fabian, do you really believe that your scenario is kind of more or less realistic and might happen by the end of the next year? And what black swans did you need to come there?
Thank you, Olga. Yes, indeed. So our scenario is called Transition by Mistake. And in fact, the name of the scenario is not by mistake. We had a discussion among our group, like how to call the scenario. We had the option of a Belarusian roundtable, an allusion to the Polish roundtable, even though we concluded that the situation is different. So a roundtable might be not the best title. But in general, so the title we chose, Transition by Mistake, leads us to the big question, like how do authoritarian regimes, how do they transform, or how can a democracy emerge in a highly repressive, personalist autocracy? And in fact, there's very famous, even though it's fairly recent, paper, and it looks at democratizations in the last 200 years. And in fact, it finds that the most likely occurrence is that an authoritarian ruler actually makes a mistake. And by making this mistake, this leads to kind of a chain reaction that in the end leads to a more democratic, or call it pluralist situation that could kind of entail the possibility for a democratic transformation. That is actually the situation we look at. And if you ask me, do we think that this is realistic by the end of 22? And is it likely? And then I would say no, because it actually the scenario violates two basic assumptions that we had in the very beginning. And the basic assumption was that Lukashenko is in power. In our scenario, he's actually removed by a coup by regime insiders. So one violation of an assumption. And the second one...
What happened? Why was it made possible that he was removed? What was your...
I will come to this. And the second violation of the assumption is that Russia is actually ready to negotiate. So that's we might return to this later, and we needed two black swans. I'll come to this, but the situation at the end of next year is that Lukashenko is removed by a coup. We have kind of a roundtable, a negotiation between democratic forces and regime insiders, and there's a high degree of social mobilization. So political parties are being formed or created, so it's a fairly high activity of political life. And there is a preparation at this roundtable, at these negotiations for free and fair elections in 2023, so in the year after, and the preparation after these elections of a constitutional reform. And how do we get there actually? So we still believe that even though the situation at this moment is fairly stable and Lukashenko controls the economy and regime insiders, that he still will launch this constitutional reform, be it in February or a bit later. And we believe that this is kind of a situation of stress for the regime. The referendum as such And here we come to the Black Swans event. We do not believe that this is likely, but even though that's a Black Swan event, it leads to the outcome we actually have in mind. And the one is violent repression of regime officials who are dealing with elections in Belarus. Some of them are jailed and die in prison. And this leads
what
to...
did they do?
They did not engage in falsifications. They didn't engage in mobilization of the electorate, because we still believe that the electorate needs to be mobilized. And that's why they are repressed by the regime, so repression of regime insiders, and then they end up in jail, and some of them die, and that leads kind of to a shock reaction within the regime itself. And the second assumption is that the regime insiders, there are rumors about repressions not only of these low-level officials but other high-level officials. So that changes the calculation of the regime insiders, and we have a collective action between security officials from the KGB, but Ministry of Internal Affairs, and then they conspire to topple Lukashenko. So that's I agree that a number of assumptions we had to make to lead to this result, but that only after this kind of series of events we believe that negotiations between democratic forces and regime insiders are possible at the end of 2022.
Thank you, Fabian. Also, one of the most interesting observations or insights for me personally is that these extremely high level of repressions that we do still observe in Belarus nowadays can actually also lead potentially, even in such a not very realistic scenario, but still could potentially lead to the very unintended results also for the regime people, and we don't have to forget it. So repressions can have the effects not only on people, not only on civil society, but also on those who are inside the system. So now we come to the second part of our discussion today, and we'll like to talk about the insights, about some interesting tendencies, about the chances and risks that experts saw while working on these scenarios and analyzing what happened within these scenarios afterwards. We have quite a lot of them, so we will not have the time today to speak about all of them. You'll find those who already have the paper, you'll find them in chapter 3, Insights, Chances and Risks. And they are clustered according, they're clustered whether they are general, whether these assumptions are on societal mobilization, whether they are on the elites, on Russia, on the EU, on democratic forces, and so on and so forth. So, but dear experts, if you would be asked to take only one or two insights or chances that you think to be most important for our audience today to be presented, or those that were maybe surprising for you personally while working on these scenarios, there is a chance now to do so. And as the next expert, I would like to ask Andrei Kazakevich. Andrei is the director of the Institute of Political Studies, Political Sphere in Belarus, and he also represents one of the partners of this project. So, Andrei, what do you think? What have been the most interesting or important insights for you in this scenario work?
Working in a big team is always connected to certain difficulties.
Okay.
Yes, and that's why it's a bit difficult to subscribe to all the assessments that were made on Belarus. And the other thing is that the regime actually is very controversial, and what is going on at the moment is only partially reflected in this document. The discussions we had were much broader. And even if we take into account that this is not everything that we've discussed, there's a lot of content. Many of these points are still open for discussion. Of course, we can't have this broad discussion now. We won't have enough time, but I would like to mention some insights. Okay, 2 or 3 insights, please. Okay. What is necessary in order for some positive development in Belarus to take place? As was mentioned in Chapter 3.1, it is understandable that these things are not facts, but the political forces that want political transformation in Belarus are working on these things. On the one hand, the Belarusian population has to remain stable, and has to live with the repressions it is seeing at the moment. The political field that we are seeing at the moment is going to continue these repressions in the near future. The society will have to keep a certain autonomy from the state, and it has to uphold its communication structures. So we assume that communication structures will not be destroyed. And this makes collective actions possible, even in view of the repressions taking place. It is necessary that there are some sources of information, some possibilities to communicate, either with the help of state media or with Russian media and so on. The second thing is that the Belarusian system can also develop in a more decentralized way. In the past 20 years, the Belarusian political system was quite simple to a maximum. There is a vertical of power, and the opposition is very much marginalized. The civil society is very segmented, and so on. And not much changed. However, in the past 1.5 years, new institutions emerged, and they are necessary for a transformation. But of course, it is necessary that they keep existing and develop further. I am speaking about democratic political forces, media, a civil society in the broader sense of the word. So structures which emerged in the year 2020, and some of them are also older. It is also necessary that this positive transformation of the political opposition kept its ties to the society. That the ties that are already existing can keep existing, but there is always the danger of a rupture, because many people leave the country, and I think their number is even to grow. But still, the opposition is still there, and the level of trust within the Belarusian society is also still very high. And this means in this conglomerate of different political forces, something can develop. In terms of the Western countries, it is necessary that there are 2 scenarios that include the West. They can act in a very pragmatic way. They could the situation of Belarus is nothing that is decided in Europe. It is, of course, when that comes to the migrant crisis, then this is something that is also important for Europe. But many other things happening in Belarus are happening just by itself, and a democratization of the country is nothing that the Western countries have to be necessarily interested in. But democratization of the country within the country and from inside is still possible. However, the country needs a certain neutrality. Russia needs to be willing to either support such a transition or okay, let us give other experts also the possibility to speak. Thank you, Andrei. You spoke about mobilization, about democratic forces. I would like to repeat about mobilization, that there is high potential, as you've already said. It is also what Maryna said. The fact that there's nobody in the streets at the moment doesn't mean that people lost their inner ties among themselves. And our experts are writing in our policy papers that it is possible to keep these ties. For example, on the level of less political topics. People are afraid at the moment, some other people are disappointed, but it is still possible to keep these ties among the population until a certain day X, which many people are waiting for, and keep discussing less political things. You also talked about the West, about deals with Lukashenko. And there is a certain correlation which our experts also mentioned, deals that can be made between the West without the Belarusian democratic forces. This can lead to but if this takes place, this can lead to a demoralization within the Belarusian society. And pro-democratic forces which have left Belarus can gain certain political weight, and at the same time, the Belarusian population can also look at Russia as a more or less working country. And if Belarus turns out to be a less stable country just because of what is going on at its border, it could also turn to Russia, since Russia seems to appear as a more stable country.
Proceed with you. What have been one or two most important insights for you in this work?
So I will emphasize once again some remarks on the mobilization, that it's important to understand that if you don't see massive sort of like protests on the street or some sort of like the opposition resistance activities on the ground, it doesn't mean that the protest mood disappeared somewhere. And then here on this list, we also mentioned that the regime targets virtually and continues to target virtually any independent initiative, seeing them as a threat, even those who do not actually deal with political activities, like even the shelters for survivals of domestic violence. And then in these circumstances, it's important for, let's say, like for the donor organizations, we'll cover this later in the recommendations, to help to preserve this civil society in Belarus. And then another remark, when we think about like way forward for a very like optimistic course of events, is the sort of the exaggerated expectations of the paradise after day X can lead to disillusionment in Belarusian society. I think it's interesting to keep in mind, in a sense that like now it's easy for the Belarusian democratic society to maybe put on pedestal those like Belarusian like democratic forces, idealize them, and think that they're like fighting for everything, like for all, like everything wonderful, and we will like live in a wonderful paradise with a functioning system of checks and balances afterwards. And then we will see many possibly, I don't know, like some corruption scandals or some sort of like disillusionment if we look at the, let's say, like the Maidan scenarios, or like what happened after Maidan, like to some like heroes which were sort of became some sort of like disappointment at that time for the society. But this is a normal part of how the democracy actually works, when different political groups have equal access to institutions, to the political platform, and they represent different political groups. So this is again like something thinking way forward. But that would be what I'm saying is that we will observe interesting sort of exercises of how democracy works inside the Belarusian society, because we were deprived of this sort of right and sort of like the privilege of actually knowing how the democratic institutions work and going to the to the polling station and actually knowing that your votes would be counted and not just stolen from you.
Thank you, Kaciaryna. Is there still anything missing, dear experts? We heard something on the paradise after day X. We heard something on mobilization, democratic forces, and its connection to the society, and also on the correlation between the Western reaction and the readiness and motivation of Belarusian society to act. We still have the elites. There are a number of points about the elites and the regime. Maybe someone would like to give us a comment on that. I'll say just Fabian.
Elites. So if we, at this moment, at least when I'm listening to Belarusian experts, I'm always surprised how their assumption, how they are rallying around Lukashenko. So you would always expect that some people are discontent due to economic situation, due to repressions also very to the elite, but in general it seems to be the very assumption that they are rallying still around Lukashenko. But if we assume that in a very positive scenario that some kind of transition is taking place, for example as in our scenario on transition by mistake, then we would have a situation where opposition forces, previous opposition forces, democratic forces get into negotiation with regime insiders, so representatives of the former elite, of the old elite. And it seems to me that when I look at how the current democratic forces, how they prepare for this kind of future transition, if you look at, the team Tikhanovskaya, they have their own constitution now, then they work on electoral reforms, then economists work on future economic reforms, etc. So that's very good. They prepare for this kind of potential future transition. But I think what becomes very clear in our scenario and also in the research I'm currently doing is that you need to be prepared that you will have to negotiate with previous regime insiders, which means you cannot implement the plans you have at the moment. There will be necessary loads of compromises with regime insiders because they will insist on guarantees in the future, on quotas maybe in the parliament, or even if you talk about transitional justice, they will want some guarantees for themselves because they were engaged in repressions, etc. So it's, this expectation of like a rosy future. I think we should be very pragmatic that even though the opposition has some very concrete plans on electoral reform, constitution, etc., this process of negotiation between democratic forces and regime insiders, even in the at this point unlikely situation, it's going to be fairly messy, and I think that's what we should take into account when we think about this scenario.
Thank you, Fabian. It's a very important point, and it was also very interesting when the experts tried to think, okay, how to make those elites kind of ready or receptive for such a dialogue. And concerning the Russian factor, there were quite two contradictive preconditions for that, because both the decrease of the Russian support of Lukashenko could be a sign for the elites to think more direction national dialogue or less support in Lukashenko. But at the same time, too much pressure on Lukashenko concerning Belarusian sovereignty could also be this precondition, because that they would then be afraid to lose their power to the Russian colleagues, so to say. So we'll give the last remark here to Agata. You wanted to say something about the black swans, and then we'll come to the last part before we come to the questions from the audience. Yes.
Просто хотела что-то добавить про черных лебедей.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the black swans. Olga, you asked what was the most unexpected thing for us, and that was the moment when we were asked to think about something completely unexpected that could happen. And at first it seemed a bit artificial to me, but then I was explained that, for example, the situation with Ryanair in Belarus, if we take this into account, and if we think about these black swans not just as concrete events, but as something unexpected that could happen anytime, because, for example, the regime feels unstable or because of economic problems happening, I really think that we should expect something unexpected, and they will take place. We also assumed, in terms of the elites, that Lukashenko is going to make mistakes. Almost all experts agreed that this is going to happen.
Policy recommendations. Before coming to that, I would like to mention the last, actually not the last for me, it's almost the first and most important insight that has not been mentioned yet, that the risk of a civil war in Belarus cannot still be included. I mean, we have 1.5 years after the elections and after the protests, and still there is this risk, which experts see as very high, especially if Russia reacts differently in this scenario of transition by mistake and take the side of Lukashenko and not the side of those who conspired against him. But at the same time, also the radicalization of the pro-democratic movement, like cyber partisans or some other partisan movements, could also lead to this very high danger. So in order to help this, something like this not to happen, experts also elaborated on 3 groups of policy recommendations, which you will find in Chapter 4. I want to mention that policy recommendations was not the main aim of this scenario. So the main aim was to show how differently political situation in Belarus could develop. But at the same time, after the whole great work that the experts have done, and after all the insights that we have written down, it would have been strange if we would not have published any recommendations. So they're there. And what I found interesting in this recommendation is that in most cases, when you see recommendations to certain groups, to certain aim groups, or to certain policymakers. We did it differently. The experts sort of what should be reached. So what is the goal? What is the global goal for the next year in Belarus? And then you see all the kinds of groups of decision makers who can contribute to this goal, because these goals are that big that it makes it almost impossible to reach only by acting as 1 or 2 actors. So it's a very complex thing here. So my next question will go to Maryna. Maryna, our first goal is as follows. The European Union or the West has a comprehensive strategy to tackle the Belarusian crisis. And among the recommendations that you give, for example, on the EU level, there is a EU coordinator, a comprehensive midterm EU strategy on Belarus, and also something about the sanctions, that they should not be only sanctions, but also a coordination or combination between sanctions, like sticks and carrots, between sanctions and some profits, also economic profits that the EU can give the Belarusian society after the X. My question will be as follows. Do you think that the European Union is now on the track to reach this goal? And if not, what is missing?
As a song by the Beatles go, we're all doing what we can. I guess there's still room for to step up the efforts that we see from the West, and I find it also very good that in this policy paper the West is not just Brussels, but there are separate target groups or actors as they are. It's also the national parliaments and the OSCE, and even Munich Security Conference is mentioned separately. International donors, because they are also one of the actors to help reach this goal, as well as also think tank universities and international business associations. There are some things that can be done to, let's say, improve the effectiveness of the efforts. There's a lot of people, I think, talk about a joint EU coordinator, but I think it is an important. They do have a point that there is one person to go to, somebody who will be collecting information, who will ensure that the contradictions between different member states are resolved, that will have a vision or help get a vision of this midterm strategy concerning Belarus, that the EU as such is less reactive to black swans and whatever Lukashenko is doing to keep himself the main newsmaker, but also to be able to be proactive, setting red lines, and most importantly, not forgetting its own agenda. That as long as political prisoners are still there, and now, as of today, there are 873 people behind bars who are recognized as political prisoners. As long as there's no national dialogue and no free elections, there can be no further negotiations about anything else. And also in this slide, the phone call between Angela Merkel and Lukashenko should be viewed. What is also important that this dual track is kept, that on the one hand you have the sanctions and they are in place as long as the conditions are not the same. But on the other hand, a kind of a Marshall Plan for the Belarusian society, not only for the day after the day X when it's a different country, but also how the EU can support civil society when, at the same time, when sanctioning the regime. And there are national parliaments, national governments that can work with the diasporas, that can make sure that they facilitate visas for Belarusians, that there are scholarships for all kinds of segments of the civil society being used, be it researchers or probably even musicians. So the art scene of Belarus is supported as well. The US should make use of the groups that they have in the Congress and in the Senate to follow closely on what's happening in Belarus. And the point that I would like to underscore before I give it back to Olga, that international guidelines for doing business with Belarus could be elaborated with a focus on human rights-based approach, so that not to continue business as usual with the regime, but also know that there's no harm that is done to the society at the same time.
Thank you so much. All these points are very important. So, dear guests, please download this paper and spread it in your circles. We have quite a lot of decision makers here and all the kinds of levels that might find it interesting. We'll come to the goal 2. It is as follows. Civic groups, society in Belarus, and democratic opposition in exile remain capable and relevant actors. Dear Kaciaryna, how can they?
So I'll start with pointing out if the recommendations sound way too general and broad for you. This is just another sort of illustration of the of our discussions, keeping in mind that we had experts from 3 different countries with sometimes contrasting and contradicting views, and it also again shows how difficult it could be for let's say EU member states to agree on comprehensive policy on Belarus, and also keep in mind the interests of actual Belarusian political forces. I'll start with the recommendations for the donors, for the civil society, and of course the most important goal now is to preserve the Belarusian civil society, which is under oppressions inside Belarus. Also keeping in mind that again, it's super risky now to do any sort of civic activity inside the country. And also something that I gathered from, let's say, conversations with donors is that like their observation is that people might actually get acquainted to this risks and the high price of civic society activity on the ground, and they might adjust to this costs, and there could be like this like crazy idealists appearing here and there who would still be willing to conduct those activities even though knowing what are the actual risks. And at the same time, it's important to preserve the diaspora's activities and whatever the civic initiatives that operate from abroad, and also again, like from what I know how the donors work, they turn to think about being more flexible about maybe financial ways of, I don't know, like doing like cryptocurrency and this sort of funding routes. And also it's important to support diverse initiatives within the Belarusian society, and to avoid looking for the like appointing one main beneficiary who would then impose, essentially like create another, let's say like Lukashenko-like vertical of distributing those forces and deciding who is good, like who will, you're friends with me today, so I'll support your initiative versus the other. And this is important for ensuring that the civil society in the long run remains sort of consolidated, or the political groups tend to, like, they have what to what to talk about and what to agree on, rather than just, again, like relying on some top-down distributor. Also, it's important, again, for the donors to aim for strategic patience, realizing that you won't get short-term or visible results. But again, the request for democratic change is out there in the society. Yeah, and also another remark for EU and countries of the Eastern Partnership, those who host now Belarusians who had to flee the regime. What they could do now is to provide additional safety guarantees for those who still face intimidation. And by this I mean that there are several instances where people, even those who escaped Belarus, they are stalked by, let's say, Belarusian or possibly even maybe like Russian special services outside Belarus. And it's important to ensure that those people have safety guarantees. And I stop here.
Thank you so much, Kaciaryna. Also very important points concerning the civil society or the society in Belarus, and also its representatives in exile. We'll come to the last goal that the experts formulated. It sounds like Russia is ready for informal consultations on the Belarusian issue with the West. Andrei, как сделать это?
How to make this attractive for Russia? Well, this discussion has been conducted for quite a long time, since the crisis of the last year. So the basic condition, how to make it attractive to Russia. Well, I think the number one condition is that Belarus should stay within Russia's sphere of influence. No other scenario would be considered or accepted by Russia. All others would provide ground for a harsh conflict with Russia. So everything hinges on this interest of Russia. Okay, it's open to discussion what sphere of influence is. Of course, there is Armenia, a relatively democratic country, Kyrgyzstan, where there is no consolidated authoritarianism. And of course, such questions are quite legitimate. So this is the first basic assumption, the first basic condition. A second one is that Russia itself should be involved in discussions on how to defuse the Belarus crisis and in the negotiations between the opposition and the regime. So it's also a necessary condition that Russia should have a constructive position in that regard. And another point is the potential position of Belarus versus Russia. If Russia has motives to have good relations with the West, it will have motives to be constructive with regard to Belarus. If there are sanctions or if regional security will be affected, this would make Russia less interested in diffusing or resolving the Belarus crisis, and Russia would most probably be interested in that case to have Belarus as another frozen crisis, and in applying the well-familiar, well-tried mechanisms to keep it frozen. Another refining question, Andrei, maybe it's already exists in the heads of many who have read our paper on how to reach goals. In this chapter, we see Germany, the United States, the expert community, but there is no EU as an actor. Does this ring a bell for you? What does it tell you? Because there could be some recommendations coinciding with the recommendations contained here. Well, this discussion we have heard in many contexts. I think it's nation states rather than the EU who could act most effectively, because in the EU there is bureaucracy and too many interests that would have to be harmonized and put into conformity with one another. So I think it would be most logical to rely on nation states such as Germany, maybe France, rather than some supranational structures or institutions. Well, maybe some other countries as well. But looking at some parameters, if we look at possible scenarios for such negotiations to resolve the Belarus crisis, Germany always ends up being a key player in all scenarios.
First, to give you a final word before we come to the part questions and answers. We've planned about 20 minutes for questions. Also, for those who follow us online, you will have the opportunity to write your questions in the question comment section of the YouTube channel of the German Belarusian Society. So please do so if you have questions. Dear experts, I'll ask each of you one question. Please be sure you answer shortly within 30 to 60 seconds. Fabian, why is Belarus important for the European Union?
Yes, well, even though Andrei has argued that it's mostly national states, member states that have a crucial role, I think it's there are several reasons why it's important, and one of them is Belarus is a normative challenge for the EU. So there are EU values as there's a lot of pathos, but democracy, free elections, market economy, etc. So in order to remain credible as a European Union, the European Union has to take kind of this largest non-violent civil movement, etc., and the needs of the Belarusian society has to take it seriously. The second one, it's a geopolitical challenge for the. There's been lots of talk about that by the European Commission, in various strategy papers, the EU wants to act more geopolitically, and it seems to be at this point very hesitant. But we have actually seen, in terms of companies, Turkish Airlines or Aeroflot, as soon as the threats were there, that they would be in danger, they kind of reacted. So the EU has some leverage, some economic leverage to act, and if some red lines are crossed, then the union has kind of to use this economic leverage. And the last point is, I think Belarus is really a crucial test case for the European Union as a union. So there's a lot of different positions in the Union on Belarus, and it's really whether they can act as a union or whether they will be split on these issues. And that's in this regard, I think Belarus is one of the crucial cases in the next years.
Thank you, Fabian. Agata. Will the Belarusian crisis unite Poland and Germany or split them?
Я хотела бы, чтобы
I would like this crisis to contribute to a good, to the formation of a good solution for Belarus. But the recent period, the recent developments showed that we have different, diverging objectives. What I mean by this? Why is there tension in Poland over the democratic crisis? But please be very short, be very brief. Yes, I understand, but there are voices who claim that migrants suffer, migrants are dying, and something should be done immediately, urgently. But what's interesting that among these people, I don't see anyone who is familiar with the Belarus situation. And my wish is that in elaborating this policy with regard to Belarus, we shouldn't have to choose between the fates of the Belarus society and the fates of those migrants.
To a national dialogue in Belarus. In 1 minute, please.
Да, 1 минуту. Ну, наверное, самый простой механизм это.
Well, I think the simplest mechanism is to make the elites incur financial losses. I think this would be the right stimulus, the most obvious one. Even if we'll take this scenario and those developments from August to up to now, I think they should incur losses, not just financial, but political, psychological, I mean, some kind of discomfort. And that discomfort, those losses would make any actor more pliable to compromise, and political elites are no exception.
Will Belarusian democratic forces in exile stay united?
I would rather put question differently and ask, like, will they stay relevant? And for this, they need to stay united. And to stay united, they have to sort of not to be lured by this illusion that they probably are that each of them is like the most important person now who is like shining brightly on, so let's say, like enjoying all the international attention and trying to sort of like get rid of their like opponents who also tend to get the same international attention. So they have to deal with like to find the balance between the political ambitions or personal ambitions they have and the work for the common goal. And also for the opposition to stay relevant, they have to have the political support of the Western liberal democracies, because it gives them additional political weight when they, let's say, tend to communicate with Russia or in general to be perceived seriously on international arena.
Thank you, Kaciaryna. Last but not least, Maryna, you get a question for 1 million. Is democracy possible in Belarus?
Absolutely. And not to make it a challenge for the translators, I will try not to speak too quickly. If you asked me a year and a half ago if democracy is possible in Belarus, I would say that yes, absolutely. This is a largely mono-ethnic country with no serious civic, religious, or whatever other internal conflicts, with quite law-abiding people. Answering this question now, I say absolutely yes. What the protest revealed, the pictures that we saw a year and a half ago, beautiful, powerful people wanting the rule of law, and this is basically what, for me, is the ground for any democratic system. We saw people taking off shoes to climb a bench, massive crowds joining protest, stopping at red traffic lights. On the one hand. On the other hand, I do hope that this very, very traumatic experience that people go through in Belarus currently and are still undergoing, that it will basically in the midterm translate into an elegy against populist and dictatorial regimes.
Thank you very much. Very nice words for the end of our discussion. So, dear audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We can gather the questions first, and please also shortly introduce yourself. You can ask question in English or in Russian. Okay, I see two hands. Stefan.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I stand up so that I can see you. I have three very brief points. So the first, Olga mentioned...
Stefan, could you introduce?
Yeah. So my name is Stefan Meleas. I'm working for Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Olga, you mentioned briefly that the threat of a civil war in Belarus was highly sort of evaluated or discussed or seen in the discussion during the workshop. How? I'm just wondering, and rather the question whether the scenario of integrating Belarus into the Russian Federation wasn't considered as a potential threat or development. The second point is. Maryna mentioned, you also referred, Olga, to the phone call of Merkel to Lukashenko before she talked to Putin. Would, in your sort of methodology, this be a black swan as well? And then to Fabian, the question when talking about the elite, so you were sort of talking about the elite as such, but were you also considering that the elite, actually the Belarusian elite, is split into a pro-Russian and a let's say, Belarusian elite, so that we actually cannot talk about the elite as such, but at least two pretty opposing to each other fractions of elite in Belarus? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. As long as we have three questions, I'll suggest that the experts answer them now, and then we'll gather two or three more questions. So, who would like to answer the questions on the civil war? Who would like to answer the questions on Merkel and Lukashenko's phone call as a black swan? And the last one was for Fabian on the Belarusian elites. Should we start with the civil war question? Andrei is responsible for that, right?
No, personally, I don't think that any kind of civil war is possible in Belarus. I think it's unlikely, actually. But of course, some kind of civil conflict in long term, even civil conflict is possible, because now we see that Belarusian authorities are trying to broaden the gap between supporters of the regime and those who oppose. So probably not war, but conflict is possible and should be taken into consideration. And concerning Russia and possible integration of Belarus into Russia, I don't think so. I don't think that this scenario is likely to, because there are many restrictions for Russia to do so. Internal restrictions concerning public opinion, external concerning reaction of the West, possible reaction of the West, and also the situation in Belarus. Because Belarusian elites don't want to be integrated, and in Belarusian society this idea is not very popular. No more than 5–10%, according to different polls, support the idea of incorporation, actually.
Thank you, Andrei. Fabian, do you have anything to add on the elites question?
Maybe just very briefly. I mean, of course, that was a simplified kind of view on the Belarusian elite. It's just that at the moment, the overall impression is that there are no larger elite splits that might have an effect on the macro level of how the regime might develop in the next year. But sure, we could discuss, like, there's certainly like a few that kind of economists versus Siloviki, or it's like the pockets of Lukashenko, not some mini oligarchs and some regional divisions maybe, and certainly pro-Russia and pro-Belarus or pro-more sovereignty oriented elites. That's certainly one of the divisions that need to be taken into account. But the main statement was that at this point, at least, that was the result of our discussion. I think there were not that many agreements that at this point it seems to be fairly united and not willing to act collectively against Lukashenko.
Thank you. On the Black Swan question, I'm not sure that I got it right, but if it's the case, I mean, we have a very similar black swan in the scenario of Kazakhstan, but it's Poland that is reaching some agreements with Lukashenko, and that demobilize and demoralize the Belarusian society, right? So in this case, it's just another state, but it's more or less, do you see it right?
Because, okay, in our scenario, Black Swan was the accident on the border, which provoked the negotiation between, the negotiation with Lukashenko. In that sense, this call Merkel to Lukashenko, it's why we name it as our Black Swan is realizing.
So you had some Polish soldiers that died during this accident, and that led Poland to negotiations with the Belarusian regime. Okay, I'll proceed with the questions. I have four hands, so please, dear guests, make sure that you have only one question so that all of you could ask it. I think a representative of Euroradio wanted to ask something, and then we have 3 more hands. Mm-hmm.
I allow to read a question from our YouTube chat, if it's not a problem. For panel in general, are there any steps being undertaken by the Belarusian or Western organizations to free the political prisoners?
Okay, I think we can proceed with Euroradio. Thank you.
Some days ago, Pavel Matsukevich, a former diplomat and analyst, was with our channel, and I didn't know that such a big group of experts was working on such a wonderful legend on what Belarus is going to look like in the future. But it seemed that he knew, because when I asked him how he sees the development in Belarus, he answered that the question of sanctions has to be revised, and maybe we should stop that, and maybe we should stop a dialogue between the West and Lukashenko. We have to stop repressions for the civil society to start to be reborn, so that in 2025 a reborn civil society could start a second attempt at the next presidential elections to change the regime. Then I started to discuss with him because of this scenario, and I said that probably in 2025 the opposition won't be reborn to such a state that it could act in such a way. But it seems that everything he said is also represented in your wonderful political legend. Thank you very much. Pavel Mazukevich was actually not a member of our workshop, but he wrote a different policy paper on politics in terms of Russia, and I also recommend this policy paper to you.
The third question, do we have any other questions? Please raise your hands who still want to ask something. So we only have one hand or two hands? Three, okay. So I see, okay. So we give the word to the second row. I'm sorry, I don't know the name, but второй ряд. Then we'll give the word to experts, and then we'll make the last round of questions. Thank you.
So my name is Johannes Rohr, and I'm with a small NGO called Institute for Action for Ecology and Action Anthropology, but which doesn't really work in Belarus. So my interest is mostly like really private. But there's one thing I wanted to ask about, because last year in August it felt a bit like 1989 in East Germany. But of course the big difference back then was not only the occupant of the Kremlin, but also that the regime did not dare to use violence. It did not dare to shoot. And that was, I mean, back then there was a big worry that the GDR leadership might actually use the Chinese solution, because that was like shortly after the massacre on the Tiananmen Square. But they didn't. And that's why the peaceful revolution could succeed. And now Lukashenko has seen that, well, using violence and having no red lines, nothing that stops you. You just use violence, continue to use violence, and that's what saved him. And I just wonder if the protests were to come back. I mean, Lukashenko has now learned this lesson that violence will save him. So what's going to happen next time? Do you expect that there could be another wave of protests which is not intimidated by violence? Or, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the question is whether and how the protests could come back. I would suggest that we have one answer for each question. The role of violence, okay. So I suggest that we have only one answer per expert and one answer per question. So I will repeat the questions, and please decide whoever would like to answer them, since we still have another round. So the first question was about steps to free political prisoners. The second question about sanctions and the possibilities to come back to negotiations in order to free prisoners in Belarus and to give the opportunity to civil society to act. And the last question about the protests coming back and the role of violence. Who would like to start for what?
I'll start with the first one, and this is the question that I actually heard from different MFAs of EU members, which ask, like, well, what could be done, let's say, to facilitate this, or like to sort of like decrease the level of repressions, and particularly when we speak about the release of political prisoners, well, given that the prisoners are a matter of, like, they have been the matter of trade between Lukashenko in the past years and the EU for exchange of some sort of like liberalization, and then Lukashenko would get some sort of benefits from this. I don't think we are at the point where we can actually negotiate with Lukashenko, because what he would require in return is, of course, like his recognition of his legitimacy, and that the West would sort of make some concessions about let's say, preserving the status quo. And I think that if there is such a dialogue, again, like all the aspirations of the democratic process would be betrayed. If there are other ways, again, I don't know. Like if there are, like in the eyes of the, let's say, like EU policymakers, if there are other ways to how to maybe pressure Lukashenko so that he would do that, but not at the cost of, again, like other like liberalization and shady deals with the dictator, then would be great to do so. And no, I don't know like about the actual like efforts or let's say like officially announced channels of communication to achieve these goals. There could be again some sort of informal communications and this thought like around the EU policymaking circles that we should do that.
Thank you, Kaciaryna. Any further comment, Andrei?
I can answer the question of Dmitry about the sanctions and the position of Kazakevich. Yes, well, of course, Kazakevich did not participate in this document, but in another one, Pavel. So he's also a former colleague of us. Yes, but the position of Kazakevich contains a mechanism that is not really understandable to me. Maybe it sounds nice, but to me it's not understandable. You could either remove the sanctions or stop them being active, but I think this is not going to solve the situation with Lukashenko and the civil society. So the question is, why should we remove the sanctions? And secondly, if you listen to Lukashenko and to the representatives of the state structures, the media, experts, elites, and so on, then they say that the Russian the opposition did not emerge because of sanctions, but because of external enemies, and it is necessary to weaken them, and that is a dominating argument in the discussions. So they are saying that yes, probably we have the sanctions because we have bad relations to the West, because we are political competitors. But if these sanctions were not there, then we wouldn't stay without any political opponents. And I don't see what the sense could be for the government to let the civil society quietly develop and continue to develop. Actually, the position maybe is understandable on a national level, but it's not really realistic if we are going to take into account precise mechanisms. If there are not going to be new elections in Belarus, if there's not going to be a democratic transformation, then of course it is necessary to de-escalate the internal dialogue and to find a compromise. But if there will be certain guarantees, then maybe not a complete removal of the sanctions, but maybe some voluntary decisions of Lukashenko to democratize his country and so on, then things could turn out differently. But of course, at first, there have to be some compromises in terms of democratization. At least this is what seems possible to me. It's, I think it's more doable than what Kazakevich proposed.
Этот вопрос, Agata.
Well, I would like to comment on this last question by Agata and the words of Andrei. It's not a new idea, and it's not the first time we hear this. These appeals, let's start a dialogue. Well, in fairness, and I do not claim to represent all experts, I think the openness of Belarusian society in the years before the latest elections, and the increase of contacts with Western actors, and in terms of freedom to act locally, that was one of the reasons, of the causes which caused that crackdown in 2020. And my opinion is that the Belarusian regime was so afraid of those trends that this is why they acted so. So this argument that we're discussing now, I've heard that a lot of times in Germany, on whether they could sanctions could be lifted. Also, my personal condition is that we shouldn't draw up such a plan maximum, because without achieving the completion of accomplishment of all these conditions, it would be a loss for the EU. So we shouldn't confuse the things, lifting of sanctions, dialogue, and as a dialogue could be useful as a way of contact between communications between parties, but it shouldn't be confused with negotiations with clearly defined powers and lifting of sanctions as a formal result of that.
Second question, the third one was also answered. So I just add that if we allow Lukashenko to capture us in this migrant trap, and we made the de-escalation our main goal, and we start the negotiation with Lukashenko, forgetting every internal question in Belarus, for sure the next wave of protest will be, let's say, meet the violence, because why somebody should change the mechanism which works?
Thank you. So our last round for questions. Please ask only one question. Sure? Okay. So I was just informed about there's no possibility to ask any questions for the time being, but you can stay during the coffee break and ask your questions personally to the experts. Thank you so much, dear experts. Thank you so much, dear guests. And once again, for those of you who would like to read the paper and still don't have it, it will be downloaded today on the webpage of Arbeitskreis, Belarus Working Group in Belarus, and please spread it as much as you can. Thank you.